that are also more mirrorings and threadings and pairings. The two 42s are significant also. Together they add up to 12 sevens, 84, 12 tribes. In other words, nobody's going to get lost. God doesn't miss a nuance, okay? The 42 and the 35 are sort of visual number play. 42 months, 3.5 years. Isaiah is definitely playing on the tribulation throughout because it's part of the reserve. And that really, it's not like to punish Israel so much as the 7 years is beyond the 1000th anniversary of David's death. It's really part of the times of the Gentiles. In fact, that's why it's called the times, plural, of the Gentiles, because Israel is not a client nation during those 7 years. She is owed the time, and it's all vested in Messiah now, so Isaiah is really stressing that. So part of the way he does that is 42 is a plan, 42 months, and 35 is a plan, 3.5. I have to ask myself if that's not why the terminology in Daniel is what it is that they're actually playing on Isaiah, because so much of what ends up being in Daniel is coming from the meter of Isaiah. So, and that also explains why Daniel isn't surprised. He's upset, but he's not surprised by what he hears. And the next thing that struck me about the way Isaiah did this is that he's splitting. He splits the 35 and 35, of course, is 70, and 28 and 28 is 56. And you'll notice that the 35 is split between 52:15 and its parallel in 53:10, like bookends. And then the 28 and the 28 is sandwiched, 9, 9, and 11, with 10 in between at 35. Why is that? This isn't Bible codes. This is just solid Bible doctrine. God uses numerology like this all the time. And it's always to reinforce and stress foundational doctrines. Trinity, God-man, the timeline, how salvation is done. David is used as a foundation in 1 Kings 6:1. That's why it suddenly switches to the 4th year of Solomon, but doesn't mention David. That means David had been dead for 3 years. That was very clever. David is foundational. See, the foundation of the temple can't be laid until David is dead. That was the 2 Samuel 7 promise. That kind of wit. The next part is really important about how the 28 works. There are two uses of the same 7 piece that was the hedge for whether Christ would be accepted. It was built into the 490, and we know that later from Daniel 9, but it was built in even prior because it was based on the 1000th anniversary of David's death. David's death would have, the 1000th anniversary would have carried time to 37 AD max. The second temple, well, what would become the second temple, but pretend it was still the first, because back in Isaiah's day, it still was. The second 490 for the first temple would have ended in 30 AD. 950, to 460, plus another 490 carries it to 30 AD. So you had two deadlines. And the way the time rules work is the earlier of the two deadlines is the one that has to be met. Well, if Christ came and was super mature by 30 AD, then that deadline would be met, so you could go to 37 AD. But everything would have to finish, the vote would have to finish by 37 AD. Now, we, with hindsight, know how it turned out, but at the time Isaiah was writing, it was open. Now, that period from 30 to 37 AD then is a hedge. If Israel did not accept, but Christ had matured, then they would have, as Isaiah predicted, the leaders at least, I mean he's talking about the leaders but the people too, would have rejected him anyway, and he would have died, just as Isaiah was explaining. But that all would have to finish by 37 AD at the latest. If it finished earlier, then the remaining time between 30 and 37 would have to play anyway. And, of course, again, with hindsight, we know that it did play between 64 and 70 AD. So you end up having two tribulation periods due to the rejection. And I think that's really important to understand because there's an awful lot of confusion out there. And there was at the time, too. You can see that in the book of Hebrews. They were expecting that the temple was going to be destroyed in 70 AD. That's why the letters went out. Paul was executed in 68 AD, and Mark was with Timothy, apparently, according to the end of 2 Timothy. So Timothy was in jail, according to Hebrews 13:23. He had been released from jail in Rome. The letter from the book of Hebrews was written from Rome. That's why a lot of people mistake it for Paul, but it's not Paul's Greek. Paul liked a coarser turn of phrase, even though he was capable of speaking elegantly. Definitely a disciple of Paul, but we don't know who it was. It's not Mark, because Mark's gospel reads very differently. But Mark had been there. So both Mark and Hebrews came out about 68 AD after Paul's death. It was reasonable to expect that because there's a 40-year warning period. And so the first 7, because of the early rejection of Christ, played out between 64 and 70 AD, or if you want to call it, you could say 66 to 73, but it still played. That left the reserved 7 from Daniel 9, because remember, it was never even part of the 490. It was taken out. So Isaiah is deducting twice, in a sense, because, well, with hindsight, we know he's deducting twice because it was going to be used. So you have to add it back, because the 21 years that they were rebuilding the temple, plus the extra 7 in reserve for if they rejected, would be used up. See, on the left-hand side of the ledger, his deduction, you got the 14 years, because God was going to have to grant an extra 14 years in order for there to be enough time to rebuild. And it took 21 years, not 14, to do that. So you got an extra 7 there that's offsetting the 7. So it sounds like it's a double accounting, but it's really double entry accounting. And that's why it works. It got used up on the right-hand side of the ledger, the 21 years to rebuild the temple and the 7 years to destroy it. So notice how all these pieces are related to the temple, because Christ is a temple that the temple depicted.